the camera settings, but
Okay, well, then we'll just kind of catch up with you, okay, as we're or
yeah,
get you caught up as we're going along. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and begin. This is
okay.
a recorded session, and so that means that I will share the recording with you tomorrow when it's finished, and then you will have a chance to rewatch it if you need to, or fast forward to that part that you might have missed. And so once again, we've got Carolyn, we've got David, he's under Pam here, but his name is David, and we've got Patricia and we've got Jane. And then hopefully James will be popping in when he comes back from the veterinarian with his cat. And so I'm Kathy Adams Clark. I want to thank you all very much for coming and spending the morning with me and enjoy and having this class. I've been teaching this class since 1995. So that's like, going on who knows how long that is, 20 something years. And Patricia took it in person as a one-day class, but with COVID, I moved it online and I'm kind of enjoying the new format. I think it's fun. And I think you all are getting a little bit more out of it because it's a little bit more intimate than what we had when we were in a large classroom. You see from your handout that I am going to cover 4 things today, and that is your light meter, how it works, f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO. So those are the 4 components of your photography. And if you can learn how to, what light meter you need to set, what shutter speed you need to use, what f-stop you need to use, and whether or not you need to raise your ISO, then you can photograph virtually anything. And so getting those 4 components down, which light meter you use, and then your f-stop, your shutter speed, and your ISO, that means you can photograph anything from this blue-green macaw in Brazil to this lioness raising her head in Africa. None of these are going to stop and wait for you to get your act together and figure out whether you need to change your f-stop or your shutter speed or your ISO so that you can get the photo. You have to internalize this information, practice it, and get to the point where it's just instinct. You see the tall masted sailing ship coming through the harbor in Venice, and you know which button is important for you to push. I didn't ask, by the way, everybody see my screen and everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, super. Okay. Same thing with doing something as simple as the Milky Way. Incredibly easy photo to take, but you've got to know whether it's setting your light meter to one thing, whether it's your f-stop, your shutter speed, or your ISO, or even if it's something as cute or as personal to you as just the kids across the table doing something cute, then you need to know immediately whether on that camera we need to push your f-stop button, whether we need to push the ISO button, whether we need to push the shutter speed, because this moment is not going to wait for you. So it's got to get to where it's just routine for you to know which one of these to push. And then you can move into the creative stuff like the cars in Cuba or the solar eclipse that's coming up, or even something like the Aurora Borealis. If you want to go with me to see this one, we go back to Norway in 2022 to see the Aurora Borealis. Or if you just want to do something as goofy as photograph your crystal ball. Anybody have a crystal ball? No. Well, come back for my crystal ball photography class later on this month and you will own a crystal ball. It's just a fun thing to photograph, and it's a different way to see the world. Or even if you want to do something as just simple as photographing your cat or your dog, you've got to know light meter, f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO. And once you get all those things down, then the world just opens up to you. And then you can apply your creativity. Photography is technical. It's not creative. You got to master the technicals, and then you can be creative with photography. So we've got to get the technicals down. I'm a technical photographer as opposed to a creative photographer. And so that's what I'm doing, is I am teaching you the technicals. So we'll get that technical stuff down, and then we can move on to the creative stuff. If you've got in your brain already accounting or engineering or anything medical or scientific training, or even quilting or pottery or woodworking or something like that, you're going to love photography because it's just as technical. And when you get all the technicals down, then you're able to create something that's beautiful. So that's what we're talking about today, is the technicals of this one. Okay, so put your camera in your hand for just a second. And first of all, some of you all have the articulating screen, the screen that pulls away, like the 90 has this one. And so if you've got that screen that pulls away, we do not use it like that. These cameras are too big and they're too heavy for you to use this with the screen folded out. So you want to fold the screen back in with the illuminated part facing out. If you're worried about scratching that screen, there is a covering called Zagg, made by Zagg, Z-A-G-G. I know there's a little kiosk up here in the Woodlands Mall that'll put the Zagg screens on your camera for you, and they don't scratch. So it gives you a film protecting just in case you needed it. It does not scratch. Carolyn was talking a little bit about the diopter, and that is this little dial if you are a Canon user, and it is a lever if you are a Nikon user. You'll see that Nikon does things one way and Canon does things another way. There's just two different corporations, both producing really, really good equipment, but they just do things in slightly different ways. And so Patricia and David with the Nikons, you all have that little lever right there. Carolyn and Jane, you all have that little dial. Now, what you're doing with that diopter is you're putting the camera up to your eye and you're pushing your button halfway down on the shutter. So you're turning the camera on, and then you are rotating that dial or moving the lever up and down until the numbers and the letters inside the viewfinder are totally clear for your eye prescription. So Carolyn, you're using Darla's camera, and so hers is probably set for her eyes versus your eyes.
And so Darla, I'm sorry, Kathy, this is my camera. I just have her lens.
Darla was using it. Okay, so now you need to set it for you, okay?
Yeah.
And if you hand your camera to a friend or you hand your camera to your spouse, you're going to find that they're not able to look through the viewfinder and see clearly because you've now set it for your eye prescription. So just understand that this is now set for your eye prescription. And so it's pretty much you looking through that viewfinder, that's you. If your eyes get tired, you wear contacts like I do, and your eyes get tired throughout the day. If you're shooting all day long, you might need to periodically make a little bit of an adjustment in there, but rarely do you have to do that. So that's your diopter. So everybody's got that set, correct? Okay, so a quick little rundown on your individual cameras. And this is why I asked for your individual cameras. And so on the 90D, Carolyn, on your camera, this front dial right here is now going to control your shutter speed. So it's this front dial right here that controls your shutter speed. Carolyn, also on your camera right here at the front of it, right here next to the command dial, what's called the command dial, there's a little bitty button. We're going to use that eventually to help you with changing the focus areas. And then Carolyn, notice that up on the top of your camera, you have some key buttons like autofocus drive, ISO, and your light meter. And you other Canons will notice that it's very similar to your camera as well. And then Carolyn, on the back of your camera, to get to this screen right here, you push the info button 3 times, and that moves you through different screens. And then also for all of you other Canon users, same thing, you push that info button 3 times and that brings you up to this screen that I want you to use. And then when you push this Q button right here, the Q button then allows you to change any of these items on the back of your camera. So this Q button Once you push the Q button, you can toggle between each one of the items on the back of the screen. And this is once again for you Canon users. So Nikon users is going to be different for you. Canon users, the big dial on the back is going to change your f-stop. And then you need to make sure, Canon users, that this dial that's marked lock is not locked. Because if you lock that dial, if you lock that button right there, then you don't have any control over anything on the back of the camera. So Jane and Carolyn, make sure that you don't lock that on the back of the camera.
Yes.
Okay. And then James is not here right now, but I'm going to talk to James because he can watch the recording. So James, you've got the 7D Mark II. Your controls are on the top of your camera just as well. These are your frequently used controls. This multifunction button, we're going to come back to this eventually. You use this button right here, dial right here to change your f-stop, change your shutter speed, James. And then on the back of the camera, here's your 3-button push to get to your display. Here is your lock button right there that I want you to make sure is not locked. And here's your Q button for moving around your menus on the back of the camera. And then Jane, on the top of your camera on the 5D. So once again, here's your controls right here on the top of your camera, the most frequently used controls. Jane, you notice that on the top of your camera, each button controls 2 things, a white balance and a light meter. You've got 2 different controls. One of them, when you push that button, changes with the top button, and one of them changes with the back dial. And then we've also got this multifunction button back here. Jane, on the back of your camera, 3-button push on the info button brings up your display panel. Push the Q button, and then one of these will activate and be highlighted, and then you can use your toggle to move between each one of the items on your back display panel. And also here's your lock button, and make sure that that's not locked. And then Jane, you're going to use this big dial on the back to change your f-stop. So small dial on the front on your finger to change your shutter speed, and big dial on the back to change your f-stop. Okay.
Yes.
So you Nikon users. So I've got David, you've got the 70-200, and then Patricia, you have got the 5100 in the Nikons. So David, your camera looks like this on the back, correct?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. So when you look at this back display panel on the back of your camera, you are going to push this info button. And when you push the info button, then you're also able to toggle around to some of these controls on the back of your camera. You can use this toggle right here. This is what I'm calling the toggle. And this allows you to move around on your back display panel. But your camera also, David, is a more robust camera. And so you also have buttons like I showed you on the Canons. So here's your white balance, here's your ISO right here. And here is another info button right here. So if you push this info button and then also push this info button, then this gives you the ability to do other things on the back of your camera. So it's like you've got 2 different type of controls on the back of that camera. And then David, on the top of your camera, you've also got, here's some controls over here that we're going to talk about eventually. You've got some buttons in the front of your camera that we're going to talk about eventually. Here's your light meter button, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And then, so you've also got a lot of controls on the outside of your camera as well as on this back display panel. So you're going to kind of figure out after a while what's the easiest one for you to get to. So just an overview. And then Patricia, on your camera, your 5100, yours is pretty much the same as what we're dealing with David's, except here's your info button right there on the top. And you probably already know this from the other class. And that allows you to activate your back display panel on the back of the camera. Also, Patricia, you will notice that you don't have a dial in the front of the camera. And David, you do have a dial. David, right? You've got a dial in the front of the camera? For your
Yes, I
finger?
do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Patricia, you don't have a dial in the front of your camera. You only have one dial, and that dial is on the back display panel right here. And so that back dial is your command dial. And when you push this info button right here, this I button right here, then that activates this panel right here, correct? And then you can toggle up and down with your toggle right here to each one of these items. And all of your frequently changed items are on these menu items right here. And when you toggle down, they turn orange, and then you push the info button to activate them, and then you can make changes even further. Correct?
I think so.
Okay, good. That's at least a basic orientation. And when you did your homework, the handout to please get your camera ready, I'm sure you found a lot of that stuff anyway. And so that gets you all just kind of starting. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about is you've got your camera turned on, correct?
Yes.
Everybody's good with that? Okay, camera's turned on. You're in the manual mode up on the top of the camera, the M mode up on the top of the camera.
Mhm.
So you are now totally in control of this camera. It is not going to make any changes at all before you make those changes. So you're in control of this camera. So if you would, put your camera up to your eye and look through the viewfinder and push your button halfway down. Push the shutter button halfway down. Now, when you push that shutter button halfway down, you are seeing a scale that looks somewhat like what you're seeing on my screen right now. Do you see that scale kind of in the middle of the bottom of the viewfinder? And
Yes.
James, you're not with us right now, but yours is along the right-hand edge. Carolyn, is yours along the right-hand edge or along the bottom?
Bottom.
Yours along the bottom. Jane, yours is along the bottom as well, right?
Yes, I see
Yeah,
it.
and David, same thing? Along the bottom, Patricia along the bottom, right? Okay, that scale is called your light meter. And if you put that scale in the middle, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a bit. If you put that scale in the middle, then the camera will take a perfectly exposed image, meaning the light that you see in front of you that you're trying to photograph will look like the light in the finished picture. So the light will look like the light in the finished picture. That doesn't mean that the hummingbird is frozen. That doesn't mean that the hummingbird is in focus. Those are all other items, but this is just the light. So this is called your light meter, and it's getting a proper exposure for you. If you put it in the middle, it will give you a properly exposed image, meaning the light looks like it does to your eye. So put your camera down for just a second. And let me explain to you, though, what's going on inside the camera box that you don't have any, that you can't see. So inside your camera, you have 4 different types of light meter, meaning 4 different machines that read the light in 4 different ways. And which one you set determines your final outcome. I can equate this a bit to on the stick shift down on the right-hand panel of my car. I have a button where I can push it and it goes into sport mode or comfort mode or, you know, who knows what modes. Those all control the drive of the car, but I never change them. So maybe if I push that button, I would get a better drive on my car. The light meter is the same thing. You can't see it. You can't know physically what it's doing. You have to intellectually know what it's doing. So the first light meter that I want to tell you about, and this is on your handout so you can just follow along with me. The first light meter that I want to tell you about is called the center weighted light meter. So the center weighted light meter was the first light meter that was developed by engineers back in the 1950s. Engineers were able to take that handheld light meter that my father used to hold out in front of him. And my father used to hold that handheld light meter out in front of him, and he would move dials on it. And then he would come back to his camera and move dials again. So that light meter was reading the light, and then he had to transfer that information to his camera. In the 1950s, engineers put that light meter inside the box, so inside your camera. And the first light meter that engineers developed was called the center weighted light meter. And what the center weighted light meter does is it reads all of the light in the entire frame and it averages it all together. And the center weighted light meter is not bad, but it's not very sophisticated. So in this picture of the silhouette of the shrimp boat with the sun and then the dark area in the back of it, or in the foreground, the center weighted light meter in this case would just take that bright area of the sun and mix it with this dark area of the shadows. And it would just kind of mush all the colors together. And just like if you took white paint and mixed it with black paint, you get gray. That's pretty much what the center weighted light meter would do. It just kind of averages all the colors in the frame. That's all it does. So your center weighted light meter is the oldest of the light meters, and it's the light meter with the less technology put into it. So if you would on your handout, just put a line through the center weighted light meter, because this is the light meter we don't use, because it is the oldest and it is the one with least technology put into it, modern technology put into it. And then in the 1980s, early 1980s, engineers developed a new type of light meter. And that light meter is called spot if you are a Nikon user. For you two, so you two Nikon users, this is called your spot meter. For Canon, Canon got to the naming office second. So Canon had to call it partial. So in your Canon cameras, this is called your partial light meter. And what your spot or your partial light meter does is it only reads the light in one spot of the frame. So it only reads the light right there in the middle of the frame, but it ignores the sun up there and it ignores the shadowed area. So it only perfectly exposes what's in that little circle right there in the center of your frame. So this light meter really kind of revolutionized how we took how we did photographs. Remember, this is the early 1980s, late 1970s. So prior to this, we had no way to just isolate one subject. And so this spot meter now allowed us to, if we had a performer under a spotlight with a totally dark stage behind them, we could now put that performer in that center spot, dial the f-stop, dial the shutter speed to put our light meter scale right in the middle. And now our exposure would be set for that bright area up against that really dark area. And the dark area wouldn't interfere with the exposure at all. So now we would get a perfectly exposed performer in a spotlight. This spot meter also allowed me as a bird photographer to put that spot on, say, a hawk on a branch up against a brilliant blue sky, and now take a reading just off the hawk's breast and not off the brilliant blue sky that takes up the majority of the frame. So now the hawk would be perfectly exposed, but the blue sky wouldn't interfere with the exposure, because the blue sky is a kiss of death in photography. It would make that hawk dark and I would get a silhouette of a hawk on a branch up against a brilliant blue sky. So this spot meter now allowed us to concentrate on one subject of the frame when that subject is up against a dark background or that subject is up against a light background, and only get an exposure on that subject. During this time, I was a baby photographer working my way through college at Kmart and Walmart in Southern Louisiana. And we photographed kids at that time up against solid black backgrounds or up against solid white backgrounds. And I made a ton of money because it was a new way of photographing kids. But the way we did it is we put the spot meter on the kid's face, took the exposure off the kid's face, and no matter what color that kid was, the kid's face came out perfectly exposed, but the background went totally black or totally white, depending on what background I was using. So the spot meter, or the partial meter as Canon calls it, allows us to photograph a subject when it's up against a very contrasty background. A white egret in the sunshine up against a totally black background. So this allows us to photograph something against high contrast. So on your handout, I've got your spot meter there. Canon calls it partial, but we're only going to use this about 1% of the time because we just don't photograph under those conditions that often, most of us anyway. So that's called your spot meter or your partial meter. And the meter that we're going to use the majority of the time now is called your matrix meter if you're a Nikon and your evaluative if you're Canon. So it's matrix if you're Nikon and evaluative if you're Canon. And what this light meter does is it reads this whole section of the frame and averages it. And then this section of the frame and averages it. And then this section of the frame and averages it. This section of the frame and averages it. And then this section of the frame and averages it. So it takes various sections of the frame, averages it all together. And then when you and I are just dialing in our f-stop and dialing in our shutter speed to put our light meter in the middle, the camera is really reading various segments of the frame. Now, everybody in here except Patricia's working with a newer camera and a higher end camera. And Patricia, your camera's not bad, but it's just a little bit older than the other ones that are in here. So where in the 1990s, when this light meter came out, and into the 2000s when the light meter got more developed, it started out only reading 5 segments. But now it's reading up to 64 different segments of the frame. So it's reading all over the frame. And the light meter also knows Jane, David, Carolyn's camera, and James's camera. It now knows that this is a bright area and this is a dark area, and it weights that. So by keeping your camera on the evaluative or the matrix light meter, matrix if you're Nikon, evaluative if you're Canon, you are putting the behind the scenes, under the hood, reading light mechanism on the most sophisticated that you have. And so a difference between these two would be in this shot, I used my evaluative matrix light meter. And I did one other thing, and I'll tell you about that later because it doesn't make any difference to you right now. And in this shot, I used my spot meter. So I'm telling the camera only read this center of the frame. And when I balance my light meter, make this perfectly exposed. And the difference between the two pictures is simply that the one with the silhouette was done with my evaluative or my matrix light meter, because I told the camera, read everything in the frame and take into account all your little fancy mechanisms. And over on the one where you can see the side of the shrimp boat, it's now only looking at that area in the center of the frame, and that's what it's perfectly exposing. The one over on the right, The lighter picture is what I saw with my eye. The left picture is what I saw with my creative eye and what I created by being a creative photographer. So by telling the light meter how to read the light, I'm getting to my base photo and getting the exposure right the first go around. So on your camera, you want to set.
May I ask you a
Yes.
question about?
Sure.
Would these pictures have been as different as they are if the sun had been in the same spot?
Well, the sun's only in a different spot because I'm bored and there's nothing happening and I'm not getting a beautiful sunset like I expected. And so I'm just playing around with my camera at this point. But no,
So the right one would have been equally as good had the
Yeah.
sun been higher.
Exactly.
I see. Thank you.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. But it just depends on what I'm telling the light meter to read. And so you have to understand that by setting your camera's light meter, you're telling it how you want it to read light. So if you have set it for your spot or your partial meter, you're telling it only read the light in this spot. That's it. Ignore everything else. If you're setting it for your evaluative matrix light meter, you're telling it to read all of the light and then
So,
do what
Kathy?
it does with it. Yeah.
So looking at the picture on the left, so I have it on evaluative 99% of the time,
Mhm.
but if all of a sudden I really want to see the boat like it is in the right, then I've got to change the light meter. That's the only way I can do that. I can't get that picture with the evaluative on.
Exactly. Exactly. For right now, Carolyn. Later on, there's other ways to do it, but for right
Okay.
now, okay?
Okay.
Yep, that's the only way to get it. So if you're looking at a subject and it's got a lot of really bright light on it, and you've got a really, really dark background, you might want to consider punching that light meter button and rotating the dial off of evaluative matrix and into your spot or your partial. So if you ever find yourself in that situation where you notice that, whoa, I've got something really bright here and I've got a really dark background, that means that that dark background is going to factor into the equation of the light meter. Then you might want to go into spot. But once again, only about 1% of the time, okay? So on the back of your camera for right now, or on the top of your camera, because I think most of you all can do this on the top of your camera, if I'm not mistaken. Jane and Carolyn, you all are using Canons. James, you're not here, but you're using Canons also. It is the rectangle with the parentheses and the dot in the middle of it. See it right up on the top of your camera?
Yes.
Okay. And then David and Patricia, yours is again right on the top of your camera, and it is the rectangle with the 5 segments in it. You see how you've got that little dot, that little button?
Mhm.
Yeah. Patricia, you don't have one on the top?
No, I don't.
Okay, so yours is on your back display panel then? And
I'm not
it's
seeing mine on the Canon.
yours is up on the top, Carolyn?
Okay.
And it is the rectangle with the parentheses with the dot in the middle of it?
Okay. That's the button right before the light button.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think it's on the back of mine either.
It is on the back of yours, Carolyn.
No, this is Tricia.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I do see something that looks like, no, I can't think of the words. Anyway, yeah, no, I don't seem to have anything.
Okay,
Your
now when you go to your display panel on the back and you push your I button to light everything, to light the items up in orange or golden.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now go down to about the 4th one and you'll notice that when you click next to it, it says meter. The 4th one has about the icon.
Okay, there's one on the back of mine. I don't know if you can tell, but it's like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it says meter. Oop, now I lost it. It says metering.
Exactly.
And then and then when I get down to it, it's like a 5-part box.
Yes, that's what
Yes,
we're looking
okay.
for, the rectangle with 5 parts in it. Yep, that's
Okay,
your
I got it.
matrix meter.
Is
Yep,
there any way to get this light to stay on longer? It shuts down on me so quick.
it does. It does. The only way to do that is maybe in your menus, but don't go looking for it right now. It says, how long do you want the display panel to stay on for? And some cameras allow you to make that display panel stay on longer.
Yeah, I looked for a while last night without luck. So
Okay.
I'll look in my new camera that I'll be getting.
Yeah, so yours is about two seconds probably. Okay, so now we are going to learn how to balance that light meter. So now that you know what your light meter is, but see how you can't see it. There's nothing that tells you where it is except just being able to see that icon. So all of you all also on your back display panel, you need to get used to where that light meter icon is. And when you first pick your camera up and turn it on each day and look on your back display panel, that little icon, Patricia, you know where yours is right now. And then David, you can see where yours is on the back as well. And Carolyn and Jane, you'll need to be able to see where that little icon is. And then that way, if it ever gets changed, you're going to notice it. And then I don't think, let me see, I'm just going to do a random. Everybody look through your viewfinder real quick for just a second and push your button halfway down. Look through your viewfinder. And Carolyn, David, and Jane, you all might see your light meter icon showing inside your viewfinder.
Yes.
No, I do not.
No, David?
No.
No, Carolyn?
It's not that 3210123 thing. No, I don't see anything else.
No, Jane, do you see your icon through your viewfinder?
Yes, it would be the brackets with the dot in the middle.
Exactly. Okay, so Jane can see that she's got the evaluative light meter set and it gives her icon inside her camera. Okay, so everybody else, the only way you know that you've got the proper light meter set is just to look on the back display panel. So just get used to looking at your back display panel. It's a little like looking at the controls on your car when you get into your driver's seat and turn everything on. You kind of look at your dashboard, don't think anything about it most of the time. But if something shows up on your dashboard of your car, you immediately recognize it. So it's the same thing on the back of your camera. You just have to get used to what's supposed to be set. Okay, so now we're going to talk about f-stop. Okay, so f-stop, put your camera down for right now. If you look at this picture of the malachite butterfly, you'll notice that on the malachite butterfly is in sharp focus. The leaf that it's clinging to is in sharp focus. And then that one little flower is in sharp focus. But then the leaf coming toward us is out of focus. The leaves in the background are out of focus. And then the background is totally out of focus. See that? Okay, so this is a design issue. And this is by design because the human eye looks at everything that is in focus and studies everything that is in focus in a photograph. The human eye ignores everything that is out of focus. When we look at a photograph and we see things that are out of focus, the brain might just kind of scan it and go, okay, leaves. But the brain and the eye are going to go to what's in focus. The little pink flower, the malachite butterfly, that little bit of leaf that I'm showing you. So everything that we show people in focus in a photograph is what they're going to study. They're going to look at. If we want to design a photograph that people will stop and look at more often or enjoy looking at, we have to put the focus area so that the design is pleasing. And we determine what's in focus and what's out of focus in our photograph, not only with our focus point, but also with what's called depth of field, DEPTH -of-field. And we do this with aperture. So what I want you to do is take one of the pages that you from your handout and just flip it over on its back side so that you can write along with me and you can draw along with me. And I want you to draw out this scale. Give yourself plenty of room down here on the bottom to write, and give yourself plenty of room over here on the left-hand side to write. But I want you to draw a horizontal line, and underneath that, write 2.8, 3.5, 4.5, 5.6, 6.8, 8, 11, 16, 22, and 32. And then on your vertical line over on the left, I want you to write 500, 250, 125, 60, 30, 15, 8, 4, 0.3 with quotation marks, 2 with quotation marks, and then the word bulb. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay. So these numbers, 2.8, 3.5, 4.5, 5.6, 6.8, 8, 11, 16, 22, and 32 are called f-stops. F with a flourish, slash, stop. That's F, the function symbol in math, a slash, the division symbol in math, and then the word stop. And these numbers are really a mathematical formula. And luckily for you, you never have to know the mathematical formula. Where these numbers are is these are the numbers you and I talk about. 2.8, 3.5, 4.5, 5.6, 6.8, 8, 11, 16, 22, and 32. So if we're standing together photographing, you would say, Kathy, what f-stop should I use for this? And I would say, why don't you try 6.8? Let's start at 6.8. Or Carolyn might say, Kathy, what f-stop did you use on that photograph? And I would say, I used a 16 on that photograph. Okay. So these are the numbers you and I talk about. These are the numbers photographers talk about. When you take your picture into your computer later on, you can open your computer in Lightroom or Photoshop, one of the Adobe products, and you can see that you used a 6.8. Okay, so these are the numbers that photographers talk about: 2.8, 3.5, 4.5, 5.6, 6.8, etc. These are the f-stop numbers that you and I talk about. What you can't see, again, behind the scenes, in your lens is this thing called aperture. And in the lens, at the base of your lens, there are a series of metal or plastic sheets. Metal if it's a good lens, plastic if it's an inexpensive lens. There's a series of plastic sheets that open and close to let light come in through the front of the lens. So at that aperture that's letting light in at 2.8 is a really, really big hole. And you set your lens to 2.8, it's letting in a lot of light. It's a big opening. And then at 3.5, the opening gets a little smaller. And at 4.5, it gets a little smaller. And at 5.6, it gets a little smaller. And 6.8, it gets a little smaller. And 8, it gets a little smaller. And 11, it gets a little smaller. And 16, it gets a little smaller. 22, it gets really, really small. And at 32, it's just a pinprick of light coming through the lens. So when you're changing your f-stop, what's happening in the back of the lens is the aperture in the back of the lens is either opening or closing to let light come through the front of the lens. And physically, meaning physics, physically, what's happening is this thing called depth of field, D-E-P-T-H of field, depth of field. So physically what's happening is as the light coming through the front of your lens goes through all of the lenses, and there's about 9 concave and convex lenses inside your lens. When that light is going through all of those convex and concave lenses and going through that tiny opening or that big opening, we get this thing called depth of field. So at 2.8, only about 1/16 of an inch is in focus. So under 2.8, give yourself a little tiny line, because if you set your lens to 2.8, only about 1/16 of an inch is going to be in focus. And if you go to 3.5, a little bit more of your lens is going to, a little bit more of your image is going to be in focus. And if you go to 4.5, a little bit more is going to be in focus. So give yourself a little bit longer line under the 4.5. And then if you go to 5.6, a little bit more area is going to be in focus. So where at 2.8, you might have only had 1/16 of an inch in focus. At 5.6, you might actually have an inch in focus. And then at 6.8, you get a little bit more area in focus. And 11, you get a little bit more area in focus. 16 more area in focus. 32 more area in, or 22 more area in focus. And under F8, make that line nice and thick and heavy. Because there used to be this old saying in photography, F8 and be there, meaning just put that camera on F8, most stuff will be in focus, and you know, your pictures will look okay. So if you shoot in the program mode, which I hope you never do ever again after taking this class, then it puts you on F8. Most stuff will be in focus. Your picture won't be great. It won't have a lot of area that's blurred, but most stuff will be in focus. So F8 just simply means, you know, pretty good amount of areas in focus. More stuff is in focus at 11, more stuff is in focus at 16, more focus stuff is in focus at 22. And by the time you get to 32, make yourself an infinity symbol, because at 32, infinity is in focus. So if you set that f-stop on f32, from the beginning of where your camera first sees out of the lens, all the way to the mountains in the background are going to be in focus. Okay. So your f-stop controls how much of your picture is in focus and how much of your picture is not in focus. So your f-stop controls how much is in focus or how much is not in focus. F-stop. Aperture is the opening. Depth of field is how much is in focus and how much is not in focus. I don't care which word you use for right now, as long as you understand what the concept is, okay? So in a photograph like this one, I'm using an f-stop of a 5.6, and I'm going to show you how to set your f-stop in just a second. And I'm focusing on the statue's face. And you see that the background is out of focus, and you see that her hand is out of focus as well. So what's in the background?
Bricks or something.
Pink.
Yeah. Wall, fence, something like that. It's not important to the photograph. And I really don't want you to see it because it's not important to the photograph. If there were a butterfly on her finger and I wanted to get the butterfly and her face in focus, then instead of using a 5.6 on her face, I might need to go to something like an 8 to incorporate that butterfly plus her face. So when you're looking at your picture and you're thinking about what you want to design, you're thinking about what you want to convey to your audience, you have to think about what f-stop do I want to use to convey to my audience. So if I had used an F8 to get the face of the statue plus the finger in focus, then I would have let the viewer see more of the background. And that's just the trade-off I've got to make. So when you're looking at your photograph, you've got to, or what you want to photograph, you've got to think about, what am I trying to convey to my viewer? What's going to confuse my viewer? And what's going to be the best f-stop for me to use to communicate with my viewer? So what f-stop am I using here?
6.8.
6.8, Carolyn says. David, what you think?
I was also going to think 6.8.
About 6.8? What do you think, Tricia?
5.6.
5.6? Jane, what you think?
5.6 maybe.
About
Or
5.6?
five.
Okay, 5.6, by the way, is my favorite f-stop. But if you look at this picture closely, she's about a 2-year-old little girl, and you'll notice that her ears, where her earrings are, you see that they're out of focus? And then the background's obviously out of focus. What's in the background?
Pots.
Pots, yeah.
Potted
But
plants.
But you
Toys.
see, I don't want you to see that, because if you can see those pots in the background, then after you're finished looking at her face, then you're going to go back there and look at those pots. And if you've recently been shopping for plants or pots, you're going to go back there and look at those plants and those pots more than you're going to look at her. So I've distracted you. I've allowed you to be distracted. And so by
Could I ask you,
not letting you see the background. Go for it, Tricia.
the previous picture of the statue with the greenery in front of her face, that's one of my pet peeves and why I want to learn to use my camera better, because my camera will focus on that piece of greenery in front of the statue and won't let the statue go clear until I beep around and get the dot. And I'm wondering, is that because my camera is old? Is it because I don't know how to set it? Is it everything?
It's because
But you
don't know how
got the
to-
background and the foreground, huh?
You don't know how to set it. So I'm going to show you how to do that in just a moment.
Okay.
Yep. So we're gonna fix that problem on you, okay? Yeah. So
Yay.
we're gonna change that in just a moment. Okay. So your f-stop controls how much we let the viewer see and how much we let the viewer not see in the photograph. You know she's on a swing. You know she's in a garden, but the swing and the garden don't have anything to do with the photograph. The photograph is about her and about her little face. And so if I let the viewer see the swing and if I let the viewer see the garden, then the viewer gets distracted and doesn't like what they're looking at. And then their attention goes away. So you're trying to narrow the viewer's eye down to what you want them to see. We'll do that through focus, Patricia, as well. And then through your f-stop, but primarily through your f-stop. So here, for instance, an f4 creates one photograph. 22 creates another photograph. F4 creates one photograph. And F22 creates another photograph. F5.6 creates one photograph. 22 creates another photograph. So you see how much I love my crystal ball? So
Yeah.
5.
Is that actually a crystal ball?
It's
Is that actually a ball?
Yeah, it's actually a ball. It weighs 3 pounds. It's actually a ball.
Oh,
Yes.
goodness.
So 5.6, you see that the edge of the crystal ball is out of focus, but also what's in the background is out of focus. The viewer can kind of figure out what's going on, but yet the viewer isn't invited back there to go study everything. F22, now I'm inviting the viewer to go study everything. And you notice it's not totally in focus, but yet the crystal ball edges are now in focus. So your f-stop controls how much we let the viewer see in the photograph, where we direct, and then how much we let the viewer not see in the photograph. So
Kathy, I missed what you said the f-stops were on those two little girl pictures. What did you say that you had
So
used?
on the little girl with the brown hair, that was about a 4. And then the little girl with the blonde hair on the swing, that was about a 5.6.
Okay.
Okay, so put your camera in your hand now. And Trisha, I'll start with you because it's a little bit easier on your camera. You only have one dial on your camera, right? And that's on your back.
Right.
Right. So you push and hold your plus minus button on the front of the camera with your finger, and you rotate the command dial on the back, and that changes your f-stop. It's a 2-finger push, or a 1-finger push and a dial. Carolyn and
Yes.
Jane, you all rotate your back dial, and that changes your f-stop. David, you rotate your front dial, right?
Yes.
Because you're Nikon, so it has to be on the front. Canon has to be on the back. Anything that's on the front and Canon is on the back and Nikon. That's just the way it works. So you notice that that's how you change your f-stop on your camera. What's the smallest f-stop you can get? What's
Mine's
the
3.5.
3.5? Good.
5.0,
4.5 for me.
4.5, good.
5.0 for me.
5.0. Jane, what's the smallest f-stop you can get?
4.0.
4.0, good, good, good. Now I want you, if you have a zoom lens on the front of your camera, and it sounds like all of you all have a zoom lens on the front of your camera, zoom that lens in the other direction, whatever direction you have. And now what's your smallest f-stop you can get?
5.6.
Good, 5.6.
6.3.
5.6.
6.3, 5.6. Jane, what's the smallest f-stop you can get?
4.0, but I'm pointing the camera outside.
That's okay. That's okay. It doesn't matter which direction you're pointing the camera.
So it's the same, 4.0.
So Jane, no matter where you zoom your camera or your lens, you can always get a 4.0, right?
Yes.
Okay, but Carolyn and David and Trisha, when you all zoom your lens, you can either get a small number or you get a larger number when you zoom the lens, correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's because Carolyn, David, and Trisha, you all have what are called variable f-stop lenses. Jane, you have what's called a fixed f-stop lens. Carolyn,
Gotcha.
David, and Trisha, a variable f-stop lens is lighter and less expensive than a fixed f-stop lens. So if your lens had, as you zoomed it, it would always let you get to that small number, then that lens would be more expensive and that lens would be heavier. Carolyn, just kind of hold your lens up so people can see how big of a lens you're playing with there. So see, she's working with one of these, big zoom lenses like we would use for, and don't change your lens right now, Patricia, because that'll just confuse you. Tricia, just stick with that lens that you've got, okay? Don't confuse the matter. But Carolyn,
Just wondered if my big lens is variable or not.
it is a variable because I can tell just by looking at it. So if Carol had a fixed f-stop lens with that big of a lens, that lens would be like $12,000, $15,000, and it would weigh multiple pounds. So by making that lens a variable f-stop lens, it means that that lens is lighter and less expensive. Jane has got a fixed f-stop lens that has the red ring around it for Canon. Nikon has these also with the gold rings around the front of them. And these are the lenses that are more expensive, and that because they do have the fixed f-stops. So they're a little bit heavier, and then they are more expensive. Now, what's the biggest f-stop you can get? Rotate your dial to the other direction. What's the biggest f-stop you can get? $40, yeah. And zoom the other direction and see what's the biggest f-stop you can get. David, what's the biggest f-stop you can get?
22.
22. Now zoom the other way and see what's the biggest f-stop you can get.
32.
32.
36.
36, yeah. Trisha?
22 and 36.
Mm-hmm. And then Jane, yours stays at 22, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so yours stays at 22. Okay, once again, these are variable f-stop lenses. And I want you to pat yourself on the back because you now have found your f-stops on your camera. So now you know where your f-stops are. You're an hour into class. Yay, you've got f-stops under control, okay? So your f-stops control how much we let the viewer see and how much we let the viewer not see. None of you all has a lens that's in the 1.4 or on the camera right now that's in the 1.4 or the 2.8 range. You might have one in your camera bag, but don't go get it. This is just an example of a lens that's got a 1.4 or a 2.8 on it. This is a 1.4 50 millimeter lens. And this lens with that 1.4 or that 2.8, I told you that we're dealing with just, you know, tiny areas in focus, like, you know, a 1/16 of an inch. This cat, this is Socks. And the only reason I photograph him a lot for this class is because he's around the office all day long. And sometimes he lets me photograph him. So, you know, and he's pretty photogenic. But if you think about how wide a cat's nose is, it's only about a 1/16 of an inch. It's very tiny. And in this photograph, I was able to get the edge of his nose plus his eyeball in focus. So that shows you that I'm using about a 1/16 of an inch in focus. You notice that I've got that beautiful blown out background in the back, and that's what this lens is known for. But it took me about 50 pictures to get one in focus because that depth of field is so shallow. So even if you have a lens that has a 1.4 on it or a 2.8 on it, doesn't mean that you're going to shoot it at 1.8 or 2.8 because that depth of field is so shallow. What that lens is designed for is, by its design, it gives you these beautiful pure backgrounds. And so this blurry background is what that lens is designed for. So each one of your lenses that's in your camera bag or that you eventually buy, I want you to look at it as a tool. You should be able, after a while, to look at a scene like this one, this river down in Costa Rica. You should be able to look at this scene and immediately say, I need my 16 to 35 millimeter lens. So these lenses are your tools. How are you going to achieve the photo that you're trying to create? So like the handyman that I use can walk in my house and he can look at what I want him to repair, and he immediately knows what wrench to get out of his toolbox or what screwdriver to get out of his toolbox. He knows what tools he needs to use. So your lenses are your tools. And you should buy lenses and acquire lenses based on what you're trying to photograph and what you want to photograph. So just don't buy a lens willy-nilly because your friend said that you need that lens or the internet says you need that lens. You need to buy your lenses based on what you need as a photographer and what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so f-stops, back to f-stops, because now you all know where your f-stop dial is and you know how to change your f-stop. Look at this photograph of the river down in Costa Rica. What f-stop am I using?
Must be a 22 or something because the background is focused.
You got it. You got it. You got it. Everybody see that? So you can see all the way back in the background, right? So that tells you that this must be something like an f22 or an f32 for those of you that have got 32s. And Jane, you're absolutely right. It's exactly that. So you can now look at a photograph and kind of get an estimation of what f-stop a photographer is using. Now with this one, I go down to this, I see this river in Costa Rica, Segevre River in Costa Rica, and I know immediately what photo I want to create. I want a photograph with a lot of depth of field in it. That's going to be my f22 or my 32. And I want to blur the water. So I go down to the side of the river. I've got my camera on my tripod. I know that I want to see everything in the entire scene. So that means that I set my f-stop to 32 because my lens will go to 32. So I set my lens to 32. My light meter, by the way, is your matrix or your evaluative, because if you look at this entire scene, I've got some dark areas, I got some light areas, and you see that whole white area that's the blurry water? You've never seen that really with your eye. This is the first optical illusion we're going to create as a photographer. But everything throughout this entire scene, I've got all kinds of different lights and all kinds of different colors. So that tells you that this is my evaluative or my matrix light meter, because I don't have one thing against a contrasty background or a very, very dark background or a very, very light background. So I'm going to start this picture, camera on tripod, compose up the scene, f32. And now it's time to balance my light meter. And so now it's time to learn shutter speed, because shutter speed is what gives me this blurry water. And shutter speed will be what we use to balance our light meter, put the scale in the middle once we've set our f-stop. So back to that chart that you just created. I know that I want to use an f32, and that's because I want everything to be in focus. So I set my f-stop on 32, and now I take my shutter dial, and don't do anything right now because I'm going to turn you loose in just a second to do this. I take my shutter dial and I start rotating it while I'm looking through the viewfinder until the scale goes right in the middle. And when the scale goes right in the middle, I've set one number that I know. The second number I'm going to get when the scale goes right in the middle. And when the scale goes right in the middle, I have to now analyze this with my brain and say, okay, f32 means everything's going to be in focus. 1/8 of a second shutter speed. What's going to happen at an 1/8 of a second shutter speed? If you look at your handout, I have given you a clue that water turns silky at an 1/8 of a second. Now, how do I know water turns silky at an 1/8 of a second? It's just one of those things that you learn over time, or it's one of those things that somebody tells you. So if you shoot running water at an 1/8 of a second shutter speed, the water's going to blur. Water always blurs at an 1/8 of a second shutter speed. And slower than that, the water blurs even more. To where if we go really, really long shutter speed, we can make the waves on the Atlantic Ocean just disappear. So shutter speed stops movement. F-stop controls how much we let people see in our photograph and not see in our photograph. So for my photograph of that river in Costa Rica, f32, because that's my biggest f-stop I can get with this lens, and an 1/8 of a second. Now I have to look at those two numbers. And by the way, those are for that moment in time at that light. This won't hold true every single time that we'll get these two numbers together. But f32 at an 1/8 of a second for that moment in time at that moment with that light, I can now look at that and say, okay, that means that my water is going to blur and I'm going to get everything in focus. So then I'm going to focus on that rock and take my picture. Now, Jane, though, can only go to f22, right, Jane?
Yes.
Okay, so Jane's standing next to me and she's composed up the exact same scene. Let's assume that our lenses are seeing the exact same item, but she can only go to f22. And what's going to happen when she balances her light meter is because she can only go to f22, she's going to get 1/15 of a second. And she's going to say, well, wait a second. 1/15 of a second, the water's not going to blur. And that's right. The water's not going to blur at 1/15 of a second. The water's only going to blur at an 1/8 of a second or slower. And so the Jane's going to throw a hissy fit because she can't get the water to blur. But if she waits about 15 minutes for the sun to go down just a little bit more, she's going to be able to get 22 at 1/8 of a second, and I will in turn be able to get 32 at 1/4 of a second. Because the light at f22 at 1/15 of a second is exactly the same as the light at f32 at 1/8 of a second. So you see how they're forming a straight line on our graph. So f22 and 1/15 of a second are the same amount of light as f32 at 1/8 of a second. And let's say that really I'm not interested in photographic blurry water. I want to show turbulent water because I'm more interested in showing my picture to my fishing friends. And my fishing friends aren't interested in blurring water. My fishing friends are interested in turbulent water and pools of water. So if we went to f16, we would be able to balance our light meter at 1/30th of a second, which means my water would be a little bit more crisp. If I went to f11, I would be able to balance my light meter at 1/60th of a second, and my water would be a bit more turbulent. If I went to 1/8 of a second, my shutter speed would be a 1/25th of a second, 1/25th of a second, and my water would now become more turbulent, but I would be giving up my depth of field. So the area in the back of the photograph would not be as clear as it was before. But then I can also go to a 6.8 and 250th of a second, and I can also go to 5.6 at 500th of a second. Each one of these are exactly the same light. So the light in the picture would look the same. What would change is how much is in focus and how much is not in focus, and how much of the water is turbulent and how much of the water is silky. So you have a variety of places where you can balance your light meter. Where you balance your light meter is based on what you want your picture to look like, f-stop and shutter speed. So if I want to show the turbulent water, then that's my 1/25th of a second and whatever my f-stop turned out to be on that chart. And if I want to show the blurry water, because once photographers learn how to blur water, that's all we ever do is blur water from there on, because only those of us who know how to blur water can take pictures like this. So that's your 1/8 of a second at f32. But then this is my turbulent water at 1/25th of a second. So the faster the shutter speed, the more the water is going to stop. The slower the shutter speed, the more the water is going to blur. In the bottom right-hand corner of the picture, there is a little stick coming down there with some moss on it. You see that little bottom right-hand corner there? And I want you to notice that between the two photographs, that stick is still in focus. You see that? So between the two f-stops, that stick is still in focus. And then look back in the back of the photograph and you see that you can't really see that the vegetation in the back is any softer between this photograph and this photograph. See that? And that's because tools, once again, tools. I'm using a lens that by its construction and by its nature gives me really, really fat f-stops. And this is what we use in landscape photography. So we can go between an f32 and an f8 and the viewer won't notice that much. So I'm using a tool here to narrow or to make those depth of fields not so narrow like I was talking about before. But the theory of depth of field is exactly the same. Just understand, I'm not trying to cheat you on anything. I'm just showing you that there's some tools that we can use along the way. And so your f-stops control how much we let people see. And your shutter speeds control how much movement we stop and how much movement we don't stop. So looking at this scene of the canal in Venice, you notice that we can see all the way down the canal. So probably what f-stop do you think I'm using?
30 or 22.
22 or 32, exactly, exactly. And you notice that there's some people that are blurred. You see that? So shutter speed wise, you know that the water turns silky at 1/8 of a second, and see how the water's kind of blurred out? So you don't know exactly what shutter speed I'm using, but you know, since the water's blurred, I'm at 1/8 of a second or slower. Okay, you see that? So your f-stop controls how much we let the viewer see in the scene, and your shutter speed controls how much we blur or how much we don't blur in the scene. Now notice the guy with the white bag right here shopping in the window. Since he stopped to do a little window shopping, then he's a little bit more solid, as is this lady who stopped to take in some sort of view. They're both a little more solid than everybody else in the scene. Notice that? But if you want to show the gondolas in the water, then you're going to have to use a shutter speed that's fast enough to stop the gondolas. So notice the guy with the bag. He's still there. But if I don't use a fast enough shutter speed to stop the gondolas, because they're constantly moving, just disappear because they're not ever staying still long enough to record on the sensor. So if I want to see the gondolas, then I have to use a fast enough shutter speed to let the gondolas stop. So 1/25 of a second here, 1/8 of a second or slower right here. So the combination of the two numbers, we have to achieve both objectives, depth of field plus stopping the shutter, stopping the subject. And what happened in reality is I'm walking home one night in Venice and I set my tripod up and I set it to f32 and don't pay attention to my shutter speed at all. And I clicked the picture and I noticed that, whoa, the gondolas disappeared. Teaching moment, speed that shutter speed up real fast and let's show those gondolas. So if I don't have a fast enough shutter speed, then my gondolas don't show up. But you notice the light is exactly the same between the two photographs. And all that I'm doing is balancing the light meter. So if you balance the light meter, the light is exactly the same. But whether your movement is stopped or your movement is not stopped, and whether your depth of field shows everything or doesn't show everything, is all based on the numbers that you chose. Because from that little graph that we did just a second ago, you see that you have 15, 20 different places your light meter will balance. And if you were ever using those auto modes, which I don't want you to use ever again, those auto modes were just choosing two numbers. They don't know whether you're trying to stop the gondolas or freeze the gondolas or blur the water. You're the only one that knows that. And so when you balance your light meter, you now have to determine whether those two numbers are good enough to take the photograph that you're trying to take.
So let me ask you again, to make the gondolas disappear, you use a faster shutter speed?
A slower shutter speed, a longer shutter
Slower.
speed. Shutter is open a long time. And so just like the people that are blurring out, the gondolas, because they're just slipping down the canal at a nice, easy pace, they never stayed long enough to register. It's called
That's
ghost
amazing to
photography.
me.
Say it again, Jane.
That's amazing to me. I've never seen that before, how
Yes.
the gondolas disappeared.
Yeah,
Wow.
once you start doing ghost photography, it becomes a whole lot of fun. It's
Wow.
fun to make.
So once your 1/8 of a second is considered a longer shutter speed than 1/15 of a second?
Got it. The longer
Okay.
the shutter is open, the more it's your things that are going to blow. Okay. Now,
So
let's
what speed would that, like, if I did so I'm looking on the side that we drew the 4 and the 8 and the 15. If I went to a 4, that's faster than an 8.
no, that's longer.
Longer than an 8, longer
Yes,
than an 8.
because
Okay.
a fourth of a second is longer than an eighth of a second. We have to use fractions. Do you notice how we've already used a graph and
Yeah.
we're now into fractions? I mean, this is a 7th grade, student's nightmare that we're on graphing and we're using fractions. But yes, we have to use these as fractions. Now let's look at your shutter speeds on your camera. So camera back in your hand, please. Okay, you Nikons, Trisha and David, you all are going to, Trisha, you're going to rotate the dial without holding the plus minus button. David, you're going to rotate the other dial. And when you rotate the other dial, that changes your shutter speed. Carolyn and Jane and James, when you rotate your front dial, that changes your shutter speed.
Mhm.
See that?
Yes.
Yes.
So on your shutter speed, now rotating your shutter speed, what's the fastest shutter speed you can get?
8,000.
Yeah, 8,000. 8,000. Jane, fastest shutter speed you can get?
8,000.
8,000, good. Trisha, fastest shutter speed?
I don't seem to know. So the shutter speed says like 30 inches and things like that, right?
No, the fastest.
Yeah, right.
So go to like a 4,000 or an 8,000, rotate the other direction.
Okay, I've got it to, I see, 1/4,000, okay.
1/4,000, exactly. So Trisha, on your camera, the fastest shutter speed you can go to is 4,000. Carolyn, David, and Jane and James, the fastest shutter speed you all can go to is 8,000.
Right.
Shutter is inside the camera body. So f-stop, aperture is in the lens. Shutter is inside the camera body. So when you bought that camera, it came with a certain number of shutter speeds. The fastest one you all can go to is 8,000. The fastest, Patricia, you can go to is 4,000. So those 8,000s, I'll tell you, it's really, really rare we're ever going to use 8,000. 8,000, a lot of sunlight to stop the action. 4,000, it's more likely. So 4,000 we might use occasionally, but really we're going to use more of those shutter speeds a little bit lower than that. Rotate your shutter speed dial and don't get crazy and carried away, but stop the first time you see quotation marks. The first time you see quotation marks. So what's the first time you see quotation marks?
1.
1.
One.
I see 0 quotation mark 3.
0 quotation mark 3. Good. The quotation marks are a sign that we are into full seconds.
Oh, wow.
Now, Canon makes their first quotation mark at 0.3 quotation mark or 0 quotation mark 0.3, whichever one it is. Canon makes theirs at a third of a second. That's the first time we see a decimal point. We move from fractions to decimal points at a third of a second. But Canon also has a 3 that's a third of a second. Nikon, I just like the way Nikon works on that one. Nikon, the first time that we get to full seconds is with 1. And so when you see 1 with quotation marks next to it, that is when we're on full seconds. If you continue to rotate in that same direction, you'll notice that it goes from 1 second to 2 seconds to 4 seconds to 5 seconds to 10 seconds to 15 seconds. And you eventually get to 30 seconds with quotation marks. Don't go further than that. That'll take you to bulb. that 30 seconds with 2 quotation marks, those 15 seconds, those 8 seconds, those 4 seconds, where I told you we're not going to use the 8,000th of a second very much, we are going to use those quotation marks a lot. There is a lot of beautiful creative photography we can do in those full seconds of photographic bliss. So 4 seconds, 5 seconds, 15 seconds, we're going to use those a lot. We're going to use those a whole lot more than we ever would use the 30 seconds. We're using those a lot. So those 4 seconds, excuse me, those things with the quotation marks, we're going to use those. Once you get to the word bulb, B-U-L-B, and some of you might have a B on your top dial. Jane, you got a B on your top dial.
Yes.
Carolyn, you got a B on your top dial. David, I'm not sure if you got a B on your top dial. If you go past 30 seconds, David, do you just go right to bulb?
Yes.
Okay, so that's where your bulb is. Same thing with you, Tricia. That's where your bulb is. Bulb is as long as you hold the shutter button down, the shutter will stay open. And so that's what we do for some other very long exposure photography. So you're not going to use it very often, but there are some instances in photography when we use that. So shutter speeds, you notice that you have got a ton of shutter speeds. So on your handout, I have given you 5 shutter speeds that we're going to work with for the rest of this class. But first thing, I want you to balance your light meter for the very first time. Would you put your f-stop on 5.6? .6? Everybody?
Yes.
Okay. The only reason 5.6, by the way, is because every lens gets 5.6. That's the only reason we're using 5.6. Every lens gets 5.6. So I've set you on 5.6. Now I want you to balance your light meter for the first time using your shutter speed. So put your camera up to your eyes, point your camera at the window or the wall or whatever you want to point your camera at, and rotate your shutter speed dial until your scale goes right in the middle. And when your shutter speed dial goes right in the middle, would you tell me what shutter speed you got? Just yell it out and take the picture.
1/5 of a second.
Good, take the picture.
Yes.
Say it again. Could you say it again? Do what? I didn't understand the shutter speed
You
part.
set your f-stop at 5.6, correct?
Done,
Now
done,
rotate
yes.
your shutter speed dial until the scale goes right in the middle. So you have to look through your viewfinder and rotate, push your shutter button halfway down to turn everything on. And now rotate your shutter speed dial until the scale goes right in the middle. Jane got a 1/6 of a second, right, Jane?
1.5, it says.
1/5 of a
Yes.
second, good. Carolyn, what'd you get?
0.3.
0.3 of a second, good. David? You're moved out of direction of your microphone, sorry.
I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I can't get it to that dial to come on over.
If it won't come on over, rotate the other direction. If you've jammed it up against the side, then you have to rotate the other direction. So as you rotate it the other direction, it'll start coming away from the side. And you see Carolyn got a 1/3 of a second, Jane got a 1/5 of a second. So it should be slow.
Right.
I got 1/80.
1/80. Are you looking at the window?
Yes.
Yes, good. Take the picture. When you get the scale in the middle, what'd you get, David?
I'm still struggling here.
Okay, keep going.
Now you set the f-stop at 5.6 and leave it there, right?
Leave it there, exactly.
And then what do you change after that?
You rotate your shutter speed dial.
And that was on mine, on the,
back dial, your thumb dial, if I'm not mistaken. When you rotate your thumb dial, does it change your f-stop or change your shutter speed?
oh, it changes the speed. Okay, got it.
Good. Now rotate that until you get to about a 1/3 of a second or a 1/4 of a second.
Okay, I'm there.
And now put it right in the middle and take the picture. Now it's very sensitive. So when you move your camera around, you're going to need to readjust it.
Okay.
Now point your camera up at your window or up at your light. And then do the exact same thing, readjust it, take your picture again.
A third of a second?
Yeah. Take your picture when you get it in the middle. And then point your camera down at your floor. And you should get a much slower shutter speed when you point it down at the floor and take the picture again.
So it changed a lot, taking the exact same picture from one time to the next because the clouds are blocking the sun and then they don't.
Yeah, exactly. And then when you point your camera down at the floor where it's darker, then you should get a longer shutter speed, right? Turns out to be a kind of a blurry picture because it's a long shutter speed.
Shoot.
Carolyn, with that lens, you may not be able to focus on the floor.
Well, I was going to say that I was taking a picture in the room, but it was really blurry, but it's because I'm not still.
Yeah. Now pull that picture up on the back of your camera. And that's the little rectangle with the blue arrow in it.
It's blurry.
Yeah, it's blurry, but does the light look like it does in the room?
Yes.
Yeah, good. David, does the light look like it does in the room?
Yes, it does.
God,
It's pretty blurry, but it's.
But the light looks like it does, right?
Yes.
Congratulations. Trisha, does the light look like it does in the room?
It looks so good. I'm going to take it fabric shopping for matching fabric to my carpet.
Good. Jane, does it look like it does in the room?
Does, yes.
Yes. Okay. Congratulations. Pat yourself on the back again. You have now balanced your light meter. Okay.
Yay.
So you have now balanced your light meter. I gave you one number and you found the other number that'll put the scale right in the middle. So you have now balanced your light meter. And you notice that if you use that f5.6, depending on where you pointed your camera in the room, they all gave you the difference in what your shutter speed would give you. So you kept the same f-stop the same, but the shutter speed changed. So you have now balanced your light meter, okay? Camera down now. You see that I have given you, or that you see that you have a lot of shutter speeds to deal with, don't you?
Yes.
So your f-stops, it's kind of easy. Your 4.5 means you've got a shallow depth of field. Your 8 means most stuff's in focus. Your 22 means everything's in focus. So, you know, your f-stops are kind of easy. By the way, on f-stops, I didn't tell you. If you've got an f2, the way you can remember this is that 2 things are in focus. If you've got an f22, 22 things are in focus. F-stop, the bigger the number, more stuff is in focus. The smaller the number, the less stuff is in focus. Okay, that's how you can remember f-stops. F2 means 2 things are in focus. F22 means 22 things are in focus. So your f-stops are all based on how big the number is. Shutter speeds, on the other hand, I have given you 5 shutter speeds on your handout, and we're going to use those as kind of benchmarks because you see that you've got all kinds of shutter speeds to choose from. And if you're trying to figure out what shutter speed to use, you could just be sitting there and hunting and pecking all day long. So on your handout, I've given you 5 shutter speeds to deal with. The first one you already know, water blurs at 1/8 of a second. If I have gentle movement and I need to stop that movement, then I'm going to use a 1/15 of a second or higher. 15th is my starting point. I can go any faster than that if I have the light for it. 15th of a second is what I need if I've got gentle movement. So I want to photograph this redbud branch. I look through the camera, look through the viewfinder, and lo and behold, that branch is bouncing up and down just a little bit, not much, just a little bit. So if that branch is moving, I have to stop the branch by all means. Otherwise, the picture is going to be blurred, just like your all's pictures were just blurred. So now I start with my shutter speed, not my f-stop. And I dial in a 15th of a second because that'll stop the motion of the branch. And I follow with whatever with whatever f-stop I got. So if you look through the viewfinder and you've got something that's moving, your first priority has got to be your shutter speed. So I've got that branch moving. That means I need a 15th of a second or faster. So I'm going to start with my 15th of a second, follow up with whatever f-stop will put the light meter right in the middle. And now I assess the situation. 15th of a second, I know that my branch is going to be solid. It's going to stop. But then does that f-stop give me what I'm looking for in my picture or not? If it doesn't, then I can start making adjustments from there. But the lead factor is that I have to stop the branch from moving, and a 15th of a second will stop the branch from moving. If I'm photographing a living creature, blinking eyes, moving head up and down, human laughing, smiling, talking, then I need at least a 60th of a second shutter speed to stop that movement. So 60th of a second shutter speed will stop blinking eyes. It'll stop a smile. It'll stop just gently moving the head back and forth from side to side. So on Socks the cat, I use a 60th of a second. So the first number I dial in is 60, and then I dial in whatever f-stop it takes to put the scale right in the middle. So that's balancing your light meter. And you notice that with Socks the cat, that his eyes are in focus. If his eyes aren't in focus, if a living creature's eyes aren't in focus, it drives us crazy as humans. We always want the eyes to be in focus. If the eyes are not in focus, it drives us nuts. And so to make sure his eyes are in focus, I am putting my focus point right here between his eyes. If you want to put it on one eye, you can. If you want to put it on the other eye, you can. But in this case, I'm just putting it right here between his eyes. Now, let me show you where your focus points are. Tricia, this is what you were asking about and how you change your focus points. So put your camera in your hands. David, I'm going to start with you, okay? You see this little button right here on the front of your camera, in between the MF and the AF button right on the front of the camera. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Little hidden button that you'd probably never notice if I didn't point it out to you, because it has nothing on it. It's like the most secret button on that camera.
See it.
Push that in.
Mhm.
Make sure that your screen on the back of your camera is activated. And when you push that in and now look on the back of the camera, either with your front dial or your back dial, I think it's your front dial if I'm not mistaken, you're going to rotate that until you get just one focus point.
Okay. I have
Okay.
focus.
You
Here,
want,
it's AF area mode.
yeah, and you want to change the area till it comes down to only one individual focus point. You can set a big area, a middle area, a small area, or just one focus point. We want it to be one focus point.
Okay.
Tricia, on your camera, oh, excuse me, I've gone to the Canons. On the 90, Carolyn, on your camera, you see how you have this little button right here?
Yes.
Yeah. And then Jane, you've got a button right there also, but it's called an MFN button.
Yes.
And then James, speaking to you, you're not here. You got the same button on your camera. It's called an MFN button. If you all push that and then rotate one of your dials, I don't know whether it's the front dial or your back dial, but I'm going to assume it's your back dial. You can go from a wide area to a small area to a small area to a small area to just one. And then Tricia, on your camera, it's on your back display panel. We don't need it on this one. Oh, here on Carolyn and Jane and James, You're
Yes.
going from a big area to just one individual dot. And I want you to go to this dot right here, the second dot from the left.
Some of my dots have numbers to the side, like 9, 21, other things.
Yeah, that's saying, do you want 21 dots to choose from, or do you just want 9 dots to choose
Oh.
from? Yeah,
Okay, or just
Yeah.
one dot when you don't have any.
exactly,
Got
exactly,
it. All right.
exactly.
Okay, Kathy, this is Jane.
Yeah,
I'm not sure how to get to that screen where I have the option to do one dot or multiple, something other.
see this FN button right here, Jane?
Yes, yes.
Push that button and then look on your back display panel. Make
Yes.
sure your back display panel is lit up. You do that by pushing your shutter button halfway down, and then you'll get these options like this.
Okay.
And you want to be the second from the left.
Well, when I just turn my camera off to clear, and then I turn it back on,
Uh-huh.
and then I press the M. Yeah, what's coming up is, I'm going to show you one moment. It's this screen.
Yeah. Oh, you got that screen. Okay. So once again, you're going to push your back dial. You got a funny screen there. Jane, did your screen ever look? Push your info button for me on the back. Push it again for me on the back. Push it again for me on the back. There you go. Okay, that's your main screen. That's the
Okay.
screen. That's the screen you always want to start with. Now,
Yeah.
push your FN button.
I don't know what I'm doing wrong. It's still not coming up, and I'm pushing it.
Okay, you're pushing your FN button.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, it should change when you push that FN button. Okay.
Cheap camera.
No, it's not your camera, not
Okay.
at all. Not at all. Okay, so it should be, see, when you're pushing your FN button, we should be able to get that anyway. Okay, do this for me then. Canon users, okay, push your topmost right-hand button on the back of the camera. It's a rectangle with
There it
9 little
is.
dots in it.
I think that's it.
Yes. Now push your FN button, Jane,
Yes.
and rotate, and you should be able to rotate again along the top to get to the, yeah, now you got it. Super, exactly
Okay.
right. Okay, good. Carolyn, did you get it?
I found it. I never could get it to go across the top buttons unless I just pushed it with my finger, and I could do that. But I couldn't find a dial that would take it to me.
Push it with your finger. If that works for you, do it.
It worked.
Because yours
Yep.
is touch screen on the back. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And then Trisha, yours is right here on your back display panel. Got it? And you're going to push your info button. You're going to push your info button. Your microphone's off.
Okay, so I have an FN button on the side.
I'm not talking about FN button on your camera at all.
Okay.
That's on
All
their
right, so-
cameras. Okay.
Yep, and I've got, if I push my I button twice, it takes me to that matrix thing.
Good. Good. Now toggle up to the one right above it. Push in
Okay.
your OK button.
Right, and it says single point AF.
That's what you want. Good. Good.
Okay.
Okay.
And
Now,
then, but if I do this, listen, if I do this screen right here, and I do this, I move that single point all over this little box.
yes.
Okay.
Okay. I want you to be able to move your focus point, because in that photograph of the cat, I moved the focus point up to his eyes. I want you to be able to move your focus point. Your camera will focus where you tell it to focus, and you have to tell it where to focus. If you choose all the focus points, which I don't want you to choose, then the camera's going to choose one place to focus. But you're the one with the brain. I want you to choose where to focus. And so you need to get used to punching that top right-hand button if you're a Canon, activating that, and then moving those focus points around. So same thing with David, you toggle it now that you've got it
Right.
set. Tricia,
Yes.
you toggle it now that you've got it set. And so for this picture of this lioness, I'm in the Land Cruiser and I'm looking straight down on her head. And the guide tells me the moment she hears the male lion, she's going to raise her head up. She's going to look in that direction, and you're going to have just like 2 seconds to photograph her face. And so I am anticipating that with the lens I'm using, when she raises her head up, I'm going to fill the frame with her face. So I go ahead and I set a focus point up on the top of my frame, one focus point. And then I put that focus point on the top of her head. And then as she raises her head up, I just readjust the camera so that that top focus point is right there on her eye. And then I fire away. And if I need to readjust it, then I'll readjust it real fast. But you need to get used to being able to move that focus point around. If I had let the camera choose where to focus, one of those pieces of grass might have ended up grabbing the focus, and the camera would now be focused on one of those pieces of grass. So by raising that focus point up to the top of the camera and me determining where the focus point goes, I'm not letting the camera get interfered. Okay? So an important thing that you need to learn how to do is move that focus point around. I want to focus
So with this,
yeah.
with the single focus point, and you put it in that upper, and then a surprise happens, like for me, the one that frustrated me was an elk behind some trees. Then I could have shot that focus point at the elk's eye, and I would have got the good elk.
You got it.
Doggone.
You got it. You got it. So by focusing up at the top where the guy's face is, then I'm getting the guy's face in focus. So, you know, guy in a parade, put that focus point on top, and I can get his face in focus. Otherwise, if all the points are activated, his waving hand is going to grab the focus point and I'm going to lose focus. So you are now in charge of where your focus point is. Guy on a horse in a parade, next shutter speed, 250th of a second shutter speed is what I'm going to need to stop the guy as he's going by on the horse in the parade. 60th of a second shutter speed is what I need if the person is just looking at me. 250th of a second is what I need if the guy is going by in a parade in front of me. So based on the speed of the movement determines how fast my shutter speed needs to be. Kid on a swing, focus point on the kid's face. I need at least a 250th of a second to stop the kid on the swing. Whatever f-stop gives me the balanced light meter, that's the f-stop, because I have to get a fast enough shutter speed to stop the action. I'm choosing the shutter speed and I'm just defaulting to whatever f-stop it gives me. I have to accept whatever f-stop I'm given. So in this one, just simply balancing the light meter with at least 250th of a second shutter speed, keep that focus point on the kid, swing the kid, put the hands on the camera, photograph, 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 put the hand back on the kid, swing the kid again, click, 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 click. But I've got to have a fast enough shutter speed to stop the kid. Fast enough shutter speed to stop the blue-gray tanager in Costa Rica. So I'm noticing that the birds are coming there and they're hanging upside down to get the feed, the fruit that's underneath there that you can't see in the photograph. And then I've got this beautiful blurred out background. So that tells me, whoa, this is where I want to put that focus point over to the side, make my picture look different, and then use that beautiful blurred out background. So you see, now I can graduate into making this picture look more creative and making this picture look better for me. But I have to stop that bird 250th of a second shutter speed. 500th of a second shutter speed is what I need for the fluking whale. So that 500th of a second shutter speed is what I need to stop that something that's running or something that's flying. But in this case with this fluking whale, you notice also that I stopped all the water drops at the end of his tail. See that? Water blurs at 1/8 of a second, but water stops and forms balls at 500th of a second. So 500th of a second is going to stop a splash. And so that's going to make our picture look more dramatic as well. Now, the last component of balancing your light meter, which we haven't talked about yet, is your ISO. So ISO is how fast your sensor records light. The 2 Nikon users in class, your minimum ISO is 200. You can go lower than that, but your camera was engineered to take its best picture at 200. The Canons in the room, your camera was engineered to take its best photo at 100. So if you should be set there already because that was on your handout. But if you set your camera at ISO 100, if you're a Canon, or ISO 200, if you're Nikon, that is going to give you your best color, clarity, and sharpness. But in the event that you can't get a fast enough shutter speed to stop your action, then you can raise your ISO. Don't do it right now. If you raise your ISO, instead of being able to get a 500th of a second for this whale's tail, we could raise our ISO from say 200 to 400, and now we could get a shutter speed of 1,000. Or if we raised our ISO to 800, we could get 2,000. Or if we raised our ISO to 1,600, we could get 4,000. So in the event that you don't have enough light to get the shutter speed that you want, your last trick that you can pull out of your pocket is the camera's ISO. But the higher your ISO goes, the worse your picture looks. So you're degrading the quality of your photo by raising your ISO. I have also taken you off of auto ISO, which means you're in charge of your ISO. So here I am out in the Sahara Desert, and we're going to do some night photography out in the Sahara Desert for a couple of nights in Morocco. And we've eaten dinner, and now the guys are playing their drums around the fire pit for a while until it gets dark enough to do our star photography. Do not feel sorry for me. There is a flush toilet in that tower back there, so we're not totally roughing it, totally out there. But to get the men, as they're dancing around and moving their body with the rhythm of the drum, to get them solid, I have to raise my ISO to 3,200 to at least get them to a shutter speed where it's stopping the movement of their bodies as they're swaying to the music. But if I blow it up, you see that I still cannot get their hands stopped. And by blowing the picture up, you now see what's called noise. So the higher I raise my ISO, the more noise I'm going to get. I can take the picture into Lightroom or Photoshop, and I can use denoise, and I can get rid of that noise and make my picture look better, but I can never get the hands back because that came when I really took the picture. So if I want to get a high shutter speed, but I don't have enough light to get me a high shutter speed, then I can raise the ISO, and the ISO, by raising the ISO, will in turn let me get a faster shutter speed. The better your camera is, the more expensive your camera is, and the newer your camera is, the better your high ISO pictures are going to be. The older your camera is, the less expensive your camera is, the worse your high ISO pictures are going to be. So this, for instance, it was a high-end, was taken with one of the high-end Canon cameras. And I switched to both of these cameras because of their high ISO noise handling capabilities. And where the picture of the men at the Sahara Desert was at 3,200, this is probably at 5,000 ISO, because we're in the Pantanal down in Brazil. The photographers, all of us, are in a boat. We've got a motor on the back of the boat that's running, plus we've got a boatman in the back of the boat, and we got 15 photographers in the boat trying to jostle for the photograph. And so the boat is moving all over the place, and the Jaguar is walking in the underbrush in the shade. So we've got to do everything we can to get the fastest shutter speed we possibly can to stop the movement of the boat, plus stop the movement of the Jaguar. So in this case, we can pull out that ISO, raise it, take my shutters, get me my shutter speed where I need it, and I can get my photograph. So the ISO is something that we use as a last resort when we can't get a fast enough shutter speed. So instead of going into this perfume shop that I love to go into when we're in Florence on the photo tours, in the old days, I used to take photographers in there and we all had tripods, and the poor lady who ran the shop got all nervous because we were going to knock over all of her beautiful displays. And now we can walk in there, and as we walk in, I can just say, raise your ISO fast enough to give you a 60th of a second shutter speed. And now we can walk around the shop and photograph to our heart's content. So now we can raise our ISO whenever we can't get a fast enough shutter speed for what we're trying to do. So if we couldn't get a 60th of a second shutter speed because of the lighting in the shop, now we can raise the ISO and we can get the shots that we're looking for. So that ISO is the last little component. Kids doing something cute across the table from me, I put the camera on the table. I used the live view on the back of the camera, raised the ISO until I could get at least a 60th of a second shutter speed, put a focus point up on one of those kids' faces, and then without even raising the camera up to my face, I just sat there and photographed the kids. So that ISO is a beautiful thing. We use it when we need it though. Don't just set it to auto and let it go willy-nilly whenever it needs to. So I know you're tired, I know your brain's tired, but fast shutter speed or slow shutter speed?
Fast.
Fast. Jane says fast. David, do you think fast too?
I think fast.
Okay. What you think, Carolyn?
Fast.
Fast? Tricia, what you think?
Fast.
Ah, everybody's wrong. Slow shutter speed. So this would be your 30 seconds, because if I used a fast shutter speed, I would just get a tiny fraction of one of the lightning bolts. But by using a long shutter speed, I get the lightning bolt as it travels across the sky. Fast shutter speed or slow shutter speed?
Fast.
Fast, yeah.
Okay.
Wait, which is faster, 1/500th or 1/8?
1/500th of a second. Yes.
Is faster.
Is faster,
Oh, okay.
yes, yes.
Okay.
What do you think? Fast shutter speed, slow shutter speed? Jane said fast.
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 How fast do you think? 1/25th of a second or 4,000th of a second?
4,000.
4,000th of a second, exactly. And you see that I have plenty of light. I'm out on this island in the Aegean Ocean. So I got Aegean Sea, I got plenty of light. So I can easily get up to 4,000th of a second. If I can't get up to 4,000th of a second, then I can change my ISO and give myself that 4,000th of a second. And I'll warn you on something like this. The first time this acrobat did her little twist and turn, I completely blew it. I didn't know what she was going to do. And so I'm just like trying to follow her and nothing. So I had to say, please, would you do that again for me? And once I learned, it's just like learning how a bird flies or learning how a football player executes a certain play. Once you learn what to anticipate, then you can follow it a lot better. So the better you are at knowing what your subject is going to do, the better photographer you're going to be. Slow shutter speed adds to a little bit of artistry. So I'm in one of those gymnasiums that's not lit very well. This only a 20th of a second shutter speed. And rather than raise my ISO, because the worse the light is, the worse your ISO is going to look, I decided just to hold the camera as steady as I could and let those flags blur out. And that gives me a little bit more artistic photograph. Same thing here, a little bit more artistic photograph by letting the dresses blur out. So I'm going to go through this real fast because I'm running just a little bit behind, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to cover this real fast for you. So if you need to rewind the tape when I send it to you and get this, you can. Histogram. When you take a picture, you want to pull the picture up on the back of your camera and watch your histogram. You all see your picture at the histogram after you take the picture. You cannot see the histogram while you're taking the picture. So a histogram is a graph of every pixel in your photograph arranged by color. So the blackest black pixels are on the left, as you see on the bottom. The whitest white pixels are on the right of your histogram, as you see on the bottom. So if you took this picture, converted it to black and white, and then separated all of the colors out and graphed them, then that's what a histogram is. So this is how many of these colors you have, and this is how many of this color you have, and this is how many of this color you have, and how many of this color you have. So for this photograph of the cat, I wanted the sun to come through that corner window. The sun coming through the corner window is going to overexpose your image. But I didn't want to overexpose the floor or the couch or the cat. So the first time that I took the picture, I turned the camera vertical. I dialed in my f-stop. I dialed in my shutter speed. I balanced my light meter, and I focused on the cat. I took the picture. Knowing this was going to be a tricky exposure, I looked at the camera, the picture on the back of the camera, and pulled up the histogram. Anything that is totally overexposed with no possibility of recovery later on in Photoshop or Lightroom is going to blink at you, and that is called your highlight indicator. So the Canon users, Carolyn and James and Jane, when you all pull your picture up on the back of the camera and show your histogram, you all also have blinkies that are showing you what's overexposed. Dave and Trisha, you all see your histogram on one screen, and then you toggle to your next screen, and that's where you see your highlight indicators. So the first time that I look at the picture with the highlight indicator showing up, the corner of the picture is blinking. I know that because that's the sun. The floor is blinking. That means I ruined the floor. There's no detail in the floor. The couch is blinking. That means there's no detail in the old leather couch. The cat is blinking. That means that there's no detail in the cat's fur. So I need to retake the picture. And instead of balancing the light meter, I need to balance it one stop negative, one big mark negative, because there's too much light in this picture. Take the picture again, check the histogram. In the second time around, the floor's not blinking, the couch is not blinking, but the white fur here on the cat is blinking. So I need to retake the picture a second time and underexpose by 2 stops. And then the second picture, when I look at it on the back of the camera, the corner up here is blinking because that's where the sun's coming through the window. That's okay. I know that's going to happen. But the floor is okay. The couch is okay. And now there's fur in the cat. So by checking your exposure on your highlight indicator and your histogram on the back of the camera after you've taken the picture, then we know whether or not we actually got the proper exposure. So we start with the meter balanced, and then we check it, and then we know whether we've got to underexpose a little bit more or underexpose a lot more. After a while, you will develop an intuition. You look at that scene and you think, oh wait, I can't balance my light meter on that scene. That's going to take easily 2 stops underexposed. And then you'll know not even to put your light meter in the middle, but start with it 2 stops underexposed. But that's going to take you a couple of years to develop that intuition. So that's what your highlight indicator and your histogram is. So you now have 2 homework assignments before I see you next time. And you are going to balance your light meter on each one of those. And you're going to work on your f-stops and watch your background get blurry. And I will warn you that on that exercise, you need to make sure your background is as far away from your subject as possible. The further your background is away from your subject, the more you're going to be able to blur it out of focus. The second exercise, you're going to photograph some running water, like a fountain in your neighborhood or your swimming pool in your backyard or your garden hose. And you're going to go through your shutter speeds. If you do this in the bright sunlight, you're not going to be able to go all the way through all your shutter speeds because it'll be too bright. So if you can do it on an overcast day, that might help you. Or if you can do it toward the latter part of the day or the early part of the morning, that'll help you too. I will send you a link to my Dropbox, and then you can upload your pictures to the Dropbox and I can see them. And then I can also show them to everybody else next week when we come back together. So you get to share your pictures. Okay. So any questions right now?
When you say balance your light, you mean bring it to a 0?
You got it. Put the scale right in the middle.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. And that's that little meter you're looking at through the viewfinder. So you've done your f-stop, you hit your speed, then you hit the meter, the balance.
Yes. So taking that back, David, I'll rewind. I gave you on your homework assignment 1 f-stop to dial in.
Yes.
Now you dial in the shutter speed that makes the meter balance. And then on the homework, I gave you another f-stop. Now you balance the shutter speed to put the scale in the middle.
Okay.
Okay. So you start with one number and then you make the other number, you rotate the other one to get the scale in the middle. Caroline,
So you're talking about on this chart, right?
you got it. You got it.
Okay. So these numbers on the left are the f-stop numbers.
Uh-huh. And then shutter
And then-
speed numbers.
And right here on our chart, this right here, the up and down numbers are the ones on the right side? Yeah.
The shutter speeds are your fractions, are your full numbers, and your
So
f-stop,
under the word bulb is shutter speed.
you got it. Yes. And down on the bottom are your f-stops. Mhm. Okay. Y'all ready to
And then
return?
your shutter speed, you gave us in whole numbers, but over here you're giving them to us in fractions, but it's
Yes.
the same thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Because through your viewfinder, you always see them as whole numbers. On your back of the camera, you might see them as fractions, depending on your
Okay.
camera. Jane, you good?
I'm good. I'm excited. That was great.
Super. Okay. Before the information slips out of your head, go do your homework, okay?
Yes.
Okay.
And then I will see you next week, same time, same place. I'll look at your homework and then we will move on into lesson 2, okay?
Thank you
Sounds
so
good.
much.
Okay, see y'all next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.